radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Today is actually November 18th, 2017. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in Eugene, Oregon, and it's 9 o'clock in Ireland where my guest, Shaun McGee, is. So, Shaun, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you doing this again.
That's right. Well, you're pulling an Irishman away from Saturday night. I don't know how you managed it, but well done.
Well, thank you for being a real activist. We really appreciate it. So I wanted to ask you about this radioactive plume that seems to be the big question. There's a bunch of questions, and I'm wondering if you know anything about it. Since you're in Europe, you might know more about it than we hear about it here.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, at the end of the day, what we've got is the plume went over, and it went over sometime at the end of October, start of September, and they were saying it's coming from Mayak or Kazakhstan or somewhere. And of course, after Fukushima, there was an incident in a European medical isotope laboratory in 2011 in September. And the IAEA first said, it's from Pakistan. And then they said it was from Fukushima. And all the time they had, there was actually a load of us on any news that were, we hadn't actually contacted the IAEA saying, no, it can't be from there. Look at EURDEP, the radiation mapping system for Europe. And you'll see that as you get nearer to the southeast of Europe, all these little, measurements that are being measured, seem to be going up. So it can't be Pakistan or Fukushima. It has to be European based. And at the same time, a company, an NGO called CRERAD, who were in Fukushima and were in Chernobyl and in various other contaminated areas where there's mining and what have you. And they were over there giving health advice to people who were kind of stuck in this radioactive pollution. Now, they've actually come up with another sort of report, which I translated, where was it? I translated that to Nuclear News. Now, I would say at the end of the day, let me see, I'll just get the post up. We put the post up, we put a couple of posts up to do with CRERAD. Yeah, it's one is CRIIRAD. If you type that in into the search engine on nuclear-news.net, you'll get probably a couple of articles come up. The first one we posted was November 10th, and it was a report by CRERAD that were kind of looking at the at where it was coming from, and they were asking certain questions. And they were saying at the end of the day, look, no matter what we're measuring here in Europe, or no matter where it's from, whether it's Europe or Russia or wherever, that basically whoever's living near that plume, wherever that plume came away, basically it would be living in, So the bottom line is that they were saying the people that live near the plume are at risk. And they were saying we need to know where this is, And this was at quite an early stage, because they were requesting this stuff by the 5th of October. They found out about the 3rd or 4th of October, and then they basically were pushing, to find out where the actual origin of the plume was. And they didn't really get anywhere. And I think they were chewing it over. And then they decided that they would. Let me just see. So that was one report we did, and that was quite a quickly. It was actually sent to me to sort of translate and get out there. Now, just the other day, 2 days ago, we got a report. Got another PDF from CareerAd, and what they'd done is they'd written their sort of worries down. They said that, we're not prepared for another Chernobyl or another Fukushima in Europe because our radiation mapping system is not fit for purpose. They also said that whoever, like the IAEA are stopping NGOs who have the technical understanding, like, and even people like myself as well, who have an amateur interest in radiation mapping and things. They said basically that they were pretty downhearted that this had happened, and that the actual Eurodet mapping system couldn't see it, and the fact is the hidden parts of the radiation mapping, which were formed with taxpayers' money in Europe, has actually been put behind a firewall and can only be accessed if you pay for it. Excuse me, or if they allow you to basically access this stuff. So of course CareerAd was saying, well, we can't track this because you're not allowing us onto that software that will allow us to track it. So and then you're just saying, oh well, it's coming from Mayak or wherever. Anyway, there was two bits of evidence I saw that was sort of that other people hadn't talked about. One was the fact that well, I mean, obviously, there was some issues they were talking about. Where had it come from? So was it a fuel processing plant? Was it from a satellite? Or was it from a medical sort of dispensary?
Well, Shaun, this is called ruthenium?
Ruthenium 106, yeah. And I was talking to a guy who was testing it. He took a plane up in Slovakia. And he had he had a gamma testing materials, and his team also had access to air monitoring, and they were actually able to pick up the ruthenium, but it was in quite small amounts. But they did say that the reason they were able to pick it up because it's a beta emitter, which you can't really see easily.
Isn't beta like the very worst type of radioactive contamination there is?
Well, it depends on the energy, and it's the same for gamma. It depends on the energy as well. But should we say that if you had a mask on and a beta particle landed on your skin, most beta particles wouldn't really do much to you, right? Now, I'm oversimplifying this, by the way. But on the other side of the coin, if you swallowed that beta particle, you inhaled it or swallowed it, then it would get into your digestive tract or your blood system or whatever, and could end up in the body, and then be giving lots of reasonably high energy close up to where the actual which our skin is kind of could deal with quite easily, but internal organs can't. Excuse me.
Wow.
So, I mean, so basically we had the two main problems. The other big issue, and I think CareerAd picked this up, obviously was the issue about being able to track it. Now I was chatting with someone else, about this as well, and we were doing some research as you do. And so there's two points that really swung it, that it could be actually from Mayak, and that may not on this particular occasion be some IEA disinformation. Now, one is when I checked up the jet stream, which is the stream of air that is in the northern hemisphere, and it continuously flies wind around the globe. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough today.
That's all right. Listen to this. I'm going to read you this. I got this off of a website.
I'll just quickly do this before my brain forgets it.
Go ahead, please.
But bottom line is this jet stream had actually broken all the way from France all the way to nearly China.
Wow.
For that date, so when I checked it, say on the 1st of October, a date where I knew the plume would have been circulating around, then basically I could see there was a definite break in the jet stream, which goes from west to east, which gives us our trade winds and our general, wind direction. And it was broken. It had actually, if you looked on the map, which showed the jet stream, that there was a huge break over Europe at that time. That means that the wind could have come towards Europe from the east of Russia on this particular occasion. Now, I didn't look up the individual weather maps, but anyway, that's one thing.
Well,
and then
this is my question to you. This, what I found, says that this is one of the radionuclides involved in atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. So that's what this says, ruthenium-106 is. What about thinking about,
ruthenium-106, this is another fact I found out about it, is that there was 1.5 kilos of ruthenium-106 in 1 ton of spent fuel pool, of a spent fuel rod, sorry.
Oh, wow.
So, so for every ton of spent fuel rods, there's 1.5 kilograms of that. Now, what they would do, when they're sort of in the processing of it, they would stick it in nitric acid, and then you've got nitrogen dioxide, radon, and various daughters coming off that process. You'll have ruthenium-106 and its daughters. And this is the telling thing, you see, that if it was a medical source or from a space satellite, it would have been old. And, so basically...
I'm not talking about from a long time ago. I'm talking maybe there was some atmospheric testing. I mean, we know that North Korea's been doing nuclear testing. It makes sense that the United States and Russia, or maybe even China, I don't know if China has nuclear weapons, but I know Russia does, I know the United States does, and they could be doing atmospheric testing and not telling anybody. That might be what it's from. Because there's a definite plume, and you're right, it might be that old, but I don't know, it all of a sudden appeared, Shaun.
I think the giveaway was that because this guy in Slovakia had measured all the different isotopes, and one of the things he said, which surprised me, was that they had lots of different, not just ruthenium, they had rubidium-106 and had various other isotopes, which are high gamma emitting. So they were actually able to find them, even though they were very small particles. They're actually able to find track of them in the atmosphere using their gamma thing, their gamma camera, or their hotspot finder. Now, as I said, it's so it would appear, from my point of view, is that they've got the nuclear waste, fuel rods or whatever, stuck it in, they've scooped off the ruthenium and its daughters, because, the daughters are going to be in the same sort of weight, if you like, where they're skimming off the different isotopes by weight, you with me? Mm-hmm. And then they store them separately. And so when we were looking at the iodine, I think it was 125 that was released in 2011, that was because they were skimming off the reactor a couple of isotopes, and one of them, I think it was iodine 125. I'm not 100% sure. It has a 2-year half-life, whatever one it was. So they basically a pipe broke between the reactor and where they store it, and then there was a massive plume that came out of the pipe that went all over Europe. And I suspect that something similar has happened with this rubidium, where they were taking it away from the rest of the waste.
That makes sense too. So maybe that's it also.
and it might explain why there was so many of the other daughters, because obviously this ruthenium's been sitting in for 20 years or something.
Yeah.
So it's not just ruthenium 106.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually what I came up with this idea recently, and I'd like to get your opinion about it. But I think part of what we call activism is really just us breaking the nuclear taboo. I even listened to Chris Busby's interview this morning, actually, again, with Libby Halevi on the Nuclear Hot Seat. I often listen to her show twice.
Yeah, that was a good one. You did that first. I think he had a bit of practice with you, and then he went off.
Yeah,
and
he got really better. He figured out what he really wanted to say, and it was awesome because she's a great interviewer. She's very professional. She really gets it. She understands it. You know what I mean? Like here I am asking you this question about an idea that I thought up, that we are living in the post-50s people, like they call us the baby boomers, but we were really the most mega experimented on, and that's when they started the Manhattan Project, and the nuclear taboo was put in place. It wasn't just the happy atom that was sold, it was the nuclear taboo. Part of why we're called activists and radicals, and people look at us like Chris Busby said it himself this morning. When he goes into court, their method of operating is don't even acknowledge what they're saying. Ignore it completely. That is the nuclear taboo.
If anybody has any doubts about Chris or anything like that, just look at Timothy Mousseau. Now, he's got 70 peer-reviewed papers. He's got, Chris has got some peer-reviewed papers. He's got quite a lot. But Timothy Mousseau has 70 peer-reviewed papers that prove that there is health and environmental impacts from radiation.
17 or 70?
Yeah. What's that? Sorry.
17. You said.
70. No, 70.
70. So he has 70.
Now.
70 reports, and they're still not calling that definitive.
But these are all peer. I talked to him about this, and these are peer-reviewed papers. He spent 2 years basically doing each one. And that people would come back and attack the paper, and they'd say, "Okay, I'll change this," or "You're wrong with this or that," and put the evidence forward. And each paper, took like nearly 2 years, of this peer review before he could get it up. So they're kind of bulletproof, for your average pro-nuclear health physicist. And I've had an argument with a few of them about Timothy Mousseau, and all they can do is say, "Oh, he's an anti-nuclear." But you start pinning them down onto the science that he's done, and the science he's done, and his team as well, has been very, very good. It's been consistent, and he's plugged away. And the only benefit of radiation in the environment he found was that blackbirds could adapt, but they adapt at the threat of the system that allows them to develop, to deal with local or international sort of environment changes and what have you. Their adaptation mechanisms are basically the same sort of mechanisms that try to keep them alive. So they can't adapt in a global warming world. So blackbirds, they can live in radioactive places, but they can't adapt if the environment changes, if it gets hotter or drier, or they'll find it hard to adapt to those new environments. So that was the best thing, and that was the only thing, one of the few things that they reported on, and they misreported on it by saying radiation is good for you.
Yeah, because birds can adapt. Don't worry, because if the birds can adapt, so can humans. This is what I'm talking about, the nuclear taboo.
I just acted about this, and I said, "Hey, look, they're saying this," and he said, "Well, actually, they're taking me out of context because, the bird's natural adaptation, the way that we evolve, all those minerals and chemicals and whatever that help us to adapt and evolve, they're actually busy fighting the radiation." And that's what he said to me, and so I did an article about that. But, the bottom line was, though, is that, everybody who read that article, most of the people who read that article, had basically turned around and had taken the first view that, oh yeah, radiation's fine. The wildlife is doing really well in Chernobyl, and that kind of stuff, which is, is a truism, because yes, the wildlife is doing well in the fact you go there and you can see lots of wildlife. But in one report about Chernobyl dogs is that they only live a couple of years. They don't get to 8, 9.
Right. Right.
And they're all being fed by the Chernobyl workers and that. Now that's changing now. They're neutering them and all this kind of stuff, But that was something that the Chernobyl workers noticed, that these dogs weren't living until, ripe old ages, even though they were being fed and they were hanging around. They'd see them come and they'd see them, disappear. So, we're getting reports still now about radioactive deer in Norway, radioactive boars in Sweden and Germany, and and so on and so on. Yeah, well, what it is basically, we're getting more rain because of the weather changes that are occurring, and the more rain is causing moss to grow, which is causing more cesium to be picked up from the soils, which the deer are eating and the boars are eating, their mushrooms, and what have you. So at the end of the day, we're seeing, and this is not being talked about in Fukushima. This is another thing that isn't being talked about in Fukushima. And of course, another thing that isn't being talked about in Fukushima was the UN report, which was, pretty amazing. And we can talk about that maybe in a bit. Mm-hmm. I was going to say also about this radiation cloud that went over Europe, just to finish that off. I mean, the radiation cloud itself, wasn't so bad for us, but it has really highlighted, and CRERAD in the second article, the second report that I've posted up on Nuclear News. So, I mean, I'll give you a couple of quotes out of it, because I think these two quotes say a lot. It says, at the European level, to our knowledge, no instructions have been given to mobilise the networks of measurements and analytical laboratories. No official information has been released. No warning has addressed to European nationals travelling or residing in regions potentially at risk. So that was a point that CRERAD picked up on. And, I've talked to you about particles above Slovakia, the types of particles there were. I've talked to you about the weather system, and I've talked about to you about the actual specifics that have been found and that can be found in the reports that we did. Now, the fact is that I did that because I just happen to know people. I can contact them, and they can, they do reports themselves, which aren't reported on in the media. So basically, but they have a good deal of knowledge, about this, and they can test. So,
well, just today, something was published on nuclearnews.net. As you scroll down the page, it says radioactive contamination in Tokyo metropolitan area in the early stage of Fukushima Daiichi plant accident, and its fluctuation over 5 years. Is
that by Dun Renard? He's been posting it. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's pretty awesome.
That's Hervé Courtois,
Yes, I do know Hervé.
And he's pulled back a lot of his social media stuff, but he's still
obviously engaged.
Yeah, he's posting posts on Nuclear News still, from time to time.
Dr. Gordon Edwards, PhD, nuclear expert, 2017, his PDF. Intensive contamination extends over 200 kilometers south, right down to the outskirts of Tokyo. That's Dr. Gordon Edwards of Canada.
Yeah. I mean, altogether there was about 9 plumes that came from the plant. I think they measured 9 plumes.
It's still
early.
Honestly, what I have to say? I was, you'll appreciate this probably. I interviewed Donna Gilmore recently, and the containers that we store our nuclear waste in, that scandal.
Yeah, it's some great stuff on that. I'll be posting it.
I was completely unaware that they vented 24 hours a day, and that they didn't have an extra they weren't in an extra thing. The vents, it vents out to the air, every one of our containers. 24 hours a day at a minimum, carbon-14 they have measured. So all of these nuclear power facilities, our country is just being decimated with low level. I was thinking about Dr. Busby's work. I really, and I am so grateful that he's willing to come on our show and leave his show and get this information out, because he is breaking the nuclear taboo, and that is exactly what we need. Like Timothy Mousseau, 70 journals, and still people are saying it's not that harmful.
I'll tell you a little bit of a factoid about Chris. You know about RT at the moment. They're clamping down on RT because they all do judo, and I think they're all supposed to be Putin or something. The fact is, of course, there's lots of sort of left wing and even some right wing actually sort of people that do shows on there that would never get onto the BBC, for instance. So, Chris, who was actually on the BBC within the first couple of days of the disaster, saying, "Well, I think there's been a meltdown," and he was arguing with a guy with a nice bow tie who was for the pro nukes. Who was going, "Oh, I don't think there'll be a big issue," all the rest of it, and there's no melt through. We just think it's a hydrogen explosion and all that bullshit. So, and that was the BBC in the first couple of days, and Chris was there. And then Chris got bumped off the BBC very sharply after that particular
because
meeting,
he said he thought it was a nuclear meltdown. They're like, "We're not having any of that."
3 months later, it took us 3 or 4 months before we got official notification about the meltdown. So, and that's at the earliest. And we're talking about when the nuclear physicists had discovered it, had sussed it out. They were talking about it. People on the blogs had picked up on it. And also, it took a little bit longer for the newspapers to start telling us that had happened. It was even longer, wasn't it? So, the bottom line was, in reality now we've got Safecast there, so they'll be able to tell us if something happens. In Europe, we have CRIRAD, and we have ACRO, and we have, which is another French NGO that does measuring. We have the French national crowd, the IRSN, who picked up on the story first. So at the end of the day, we're quite well placed. But on the other side of the coin, we've got people in Slovakia and various other people all around the place that are doing testing as well. So at the end of the day, we need a better system, because we've got this system, European-wide system, and I've done a lot. I could talk to you for ages about it. I mean, one little point was that they updated the system, and it was updated by a Finnish guy, and he was living in Italy. Now, Eurodep has 2 servers that you can access it with, one in Italy and one in Germany. Now, when specifically actually when this the Hungary nuclear medical isotope accident happened in 2011, we used Eurodep because it was quite sensitive and it had been updated and it was working really well, and we could actually track the isotopes back to their source more or less, because there's still a lot of messing around on Eurodep, people covering up the spikes and things. So we were able to, and hiding data. So, but we were still able, with all the different countries' measuring systems, to track it back. Now, what happened was, all of a sudden, I went on there one day, and then it had gone back to the old map, So, anyway, I basically, it was during the day, and I phoned up Italy, and I talked to the guy who actually done the new map. I got through to him, and I was checking. He was a really nice guy. He could speak English, so it was really cool. And I was chatting to him about the map generally, and I said, "Well, look, are you aware that your map has been gone back to the older version, the one that's a little bit more clunky and hard to use?" And he was like, "No, I wasn't." And he's gone online, and he's holy shit. And the only way it could have happened is that somebody, and probably was the IAEA, because we're using this data to prove they were wrong. So the IAEA have obviously put the boot in Germany somewhere and just pressed the button, and or maybe they've got a server in their offices, but they've pressed the button and put the map. Well, they've done some quite big work actually, because what they did, they reversed the map to the old map. Now, this guy had spent ages and ages and loads of money, Viewerdepth's money, creating this really nice multicolored map that really did show how radiation moves around. And I'm saying the specific monitors attached to that may be messed with on occasion. You with me? So you're not getting a true story, but you can pick up on stuff. And I was doing that quite a bit. But they changed the mapping. They on and off block the isotope access. They just made it very difficult. They sometimes switched the whole map off of a country if something was going on. So there's loads of issues with Viewerdep, and the IEA are behind the abuse of Viewerdep, in my own opinion. So that's a little backstory to this CRERAD thing. So,
the IAEA is guilty of abuse of the entire planet. Let's just be clear. They're criminals. Yeah. They are liars and criminals.
The latest statement from CRERAD, which I was talking about, I mean, it's quite hard-hitting. There's one part of it which is CRERAD challenges the World Health Organization, right? That's number one, because at the end of the day, the World Health Organization has a reach from the east of Russia, the far east of Russia, from Vladivostok, all the way, to, the whole of the Northern Hemisphere, but certainly to Europe. So they if there's a health issue somewhere in Europe, they're supposed to be aware of it. But anyway, so CRERAD make these charges. And, and say that the WHO should have been on the case. But of course the IAEA stepped in many years ago and took over the radiological department of the WHO.
Because they got into a contract, they have every legal right to do that. That's their legal right to censor the World Health Organization completely if it's not in their best interest.
They don't have to give them the data, which was another major point that, about transparency and what have you, that the IAEA is not bound to.
It's also like what Chris said in his study when he went and reviewed. He found some study where they threw out the control group in the Hiroshima studies.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's the fundamental bottom line: is how did they do that and why did they do it? It's the same. That's what we're dealing. That's what I meant earlier. Is like when we talk to pro-nukers, you just pull that rug out from under them. It's been proven that the control group was taken out because the studies were the opposite of what the answer was wanted. And they've been.
But that was it. Watanabe in Japan. It was a Professor Watanabe in Japan who discovered that. Chris was told that he independently went off to get the papers for himself to check it, and it was true. But at the end of the day, then we've got CRERAD, which they work with the IAEA, they work with nuclear people, they work to look at contamination issues and health and safety, how nuclear workers can work in a safe environment. So they're quite queued up people, and they're well respected. Mm-hmm. Now they have been attacked recently by the French government, so they've ended up getting funding cut. So there they are doing this great old job, and they have, they've not even got enough money to do what they want to do, but they're doing a pretty good job with the tools they've got. And they've helped a lot of communities out in Africa with uranium and what have you, poisoning and things. So at the end of the day, they've, in the second part of their letter, so they've had a go at the World Health Organization, then they're having a go, challenging, if you like, the word they use, the International Atomic Energy Agency, so they're specifically saying to the IAEA, well, look, that you've got all these different plume maps and what have you that you've got access to. I mean, I did an article where I mentioned about NILU, the Norwegian processing, you could actually access that publicly, and they closed it off about 3 or 4 months after Fukushima to stop people going onto it. And this was like something paid for by the Norwegian taxpayers. Now Norwegian taxpayers could no longer use that mapping system that they paid for. And that was the IAEA had stepped in and said, look, this is what we've got to do. So they've had a go. They basically had a go at those two major those two major sort of organisations, and saying, look, there's a lot that needs to be done, and we're talking post Fukushima here, where we're supposed to have brought in transparency and all these, good practice and all these other things. And voices of like CRERAD and, sort of Bologna and various other, IRSN and various other organizations, are not being heard. And they're not being given the resources to do their job either, because all these resources are tied up in, behind, sort of paywalls, for the NGOs. And they're very expensive, or you have to get permission from a specific person, to be able to, go onto the mapping system. So people like you and me couldn't, do that.
Yeah.
So, I've actually asked the pro-nuclear crowd if they could
But
get...
you know
get
what, Shaun, I can offer you this. I'm a student. I can get access to studies and journals.
Oh, yeah, but no, you won't be able to get access to say, NILU, which is a Norwegian Institute of Air Atmospheric Research.
Right. You have to be a professional to even access any of that stuff.
I'm saying even the professionals can't access it. I mean, CRERAD weren't allowed to access it, and CRERAD did cover the Halden Norwegian nuclear accident, which happened in September last year, where one of the fuel rods melted down, the experimental fuel rods. So, all these organizations know one another, and, in theory, you'd have thought CRERAD would say, could we have access to your things? Oh, yeah, use this password and, off you go, son. And you think they could do that, but the fact is they're not. They're doing the opposite of that. They're stopping that happening. And that's what CRERAD said, really. And what they've said is mirrored by a lot of European, sort of pro-nuke and anti-nuke people alike, because I think even the pro-nukes would like to see that system working. If there was a small release from a German reactor, you could see it straight away, and you do sometimes, but when you go to places like England and you look at the little line that says this is the radiation level, and it never changes hardly, when I've been by one of those, with a Geiger counter, and it's been reading 0.18 microsieverts per hour, but the little line on your deck is just saying 0.11 microsievert per hour, no changing, like it was for the last 6 months, So there is definitely issues with Eurodeck, but if they were to loosen up the measuring devices so that they were more responsive, and gave a quicker response, and they took more readings in the day, as opposed to in Russia, for instance, you get I think it's 24 readings in a day, so that's 1 an hour,
So I just translated a portion of their page, CRERAD. This organization, it's in French, and they did do these articles which was translated in English, but I wanted to know who they were, understand what they did. They actually, they work towards wanting to break the nuclear taboo, essentially. They're saying on their face page, they basically say, we don't know, the response system to Chernobyl's been a failure. We don't know how many people have been exposed. We don't know what's happened with how many workers, how many inhabitants, how many people, what contaminants. But everything is fine in Europe because the ruthenium levels of 106 remain very low. Do you know what I mean? That's...
Yeah.
This is exactly...
I mean, to be honest, they're very down to earth, and in fact, a good example of how they have to work, in places like Belarus, which is a dictatorship, or Ukraine. Well, do I have to mention Ukraine to anyone in the planet? And also when they're working in Fukushima. I mean, Save the Children were told to not talk about any radiation effects, otherwise they would be kicked out of the country. They would, however, be able to do projects with kids, with post-traumatic stress, which is okay. They allowed Save the Kids to do that. But in the annual report for Save the Children, they only talked about the area where they worked, which was dealing with children which was very valuable, but dealing with children with post-traumatic stress. Now, what they didn't say is what that post-traumatic stress might be. Is it a tsunami? Yes. Is it an earthquake? Maybe less so, but yes. Is it a nuclear disaster? Well, maybe yes, But so they weren't allowed to talk about that component.
Or the illnesses that they're having and the medical problems that they're having.
Definitely not. No. definitely not. Or even the discussions that were happening in Fukushima.
And they still did it. See, for me, this is where I object to this. These organizations ought to hold the line and hold tight for saving the children, because that is called silent complicity.
Yeah, I don't know. The very early stage, I felt similar to that. I think the way to view it is that if you're going to work in a place where there's a dictatorship, I mean, where is it? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So, but here's an interesting thing about
Pre-Rad. Well, I don't know, because this is one planet. I don't know if I'm willing to let the Romans do what they want to do, because we're talking about this is affecting everybody's children.
Sure.
And these nuclear liars have got to stop. We've got to break the nuclear tape.
Right. Well, look, I'll tell you what would have happened. Say if Save the Children had stuck to their guns, say, no, we're seeing reports about radiation, and we feel that that's valid to mention because it is one of the stressors, and it would have been valid to mention because it was one of the stressors. It's part of the reason why the evacuation has lasted so long, isn't it? And so on and so on. So the bottom line is that Pre-Rad, Save the Children, they were able to go, and there was a lot of children that were traumatized, and they had specialist trauma practitioners who could basically go in and deal with the children who had that trauma. Now, it may well be the kids would be painting a nuclear explosion or something, but they could all, there's also other things they would have been painting. So when they're using art therapies and all these sort of things. Now, the Japanese themselves didn't have that mechanism to get all those people in to do that kind of work with young people, So, the bottom line is that Save the Children decided that, someone in Save the Children decided that, yes, we're going to toe the line here, we'll abide by the Japanese government's rules, and we'll turn around and we'll do that, but then we can do some good, So, and they were on the ground already, by the time they're getting their sort of like, do this.
I'm going to tell you, my gut is saying that sucks. That is a very bad decision on their part, because they could have made the impact they could have made by not going and standing up and saying, look, this is unreasonable. You guys have had a massive nuclear problem. Your people are going to be affected. It's unreasonable for them to make demands of an NGO and say, you can't come help our people if you talk about the reason that they're having trauma. These secrecy laws, this is kowtowing to authoritarianism is how Mussolini rules the world. I mean, let's be clear how Hitler took over. Everybody went, okay, I guess we have to comply. Okay. And kids and people were being hauled away, and just like they are now, there's 1 million people in Fukushima Prefecture who might look okay today, but guess what? One generation, when they start having babies, or their children have babies, if we make it that far, I'm sorry, Shaun, but I'm really like, our problem, this is too serious of a problem for us to treat it like business as usual, and we're going to do some good.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying. I mean, it's a hard line approach, and it's
it's a soft line approach. I love the children. I don't think we should. I do not believe. Excuse me, but I think this gets to the root of where we're at. It gets to the root of covering up for the abusers. These people are murderers.
I think when you're sitting there and you've got 20 or 30,000 traumatized children, and you've got to make an on-the-spot decision on whether you're going to A, help them, or B, you're going to get all your workers, pack up, and then leave the country. Your children were able to cater for many thousands of kids. They're quite a large organization. They brought in a large amount of money. They were on the ground. And, what would you have said if they'd walked away? Would you have said, applauded them?
I would have asked everyone else, yes.
They're traumatized, get no help, no
because
funding
you know what? The Japanese government would have acquiesced. They would not have allowed that to,
Not at all. We're talking about a Japanese government that's allowed, 360,000 children to get sort of, the risk of thyroid cancer, and they're denying it like anything. They're getting various specialists
because
in like
of
this
organizations like Feed the Children and all these other people, the Olympic Committee, all these other people going there saying, yeah, it's perfectly fine. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about the radiation. We're not going to, the radioactive contamination. We won't talk about the minor little irritants, the skin diseases, the rashes, the things that happen to people, the diarrhea, the bleeding noses. We won't discuss any of that. We're just going to talk about the trauma these people are suffering because of their displacement.
Yeah,
that makes me vomit.
I think I would have to agree to kind of differ about the approach, but without doubt, I could see, how somebody can make that decision, and I'm telling you that CRERAD were put in a similar position. There wasn't an agency that didn't go to the of the Japanese or the people of Fukushima, more specifically, that didn't go there to do various jobs. And in the case of CRERAD, it was giving people advice on how to spot contaminated food, what not to eat, what to eat.
Yeah.
Excuse me, and all that kind of stuff. So basically, that was also important stuff that they had to do, because otherwise, we saw after Chernobyl what would have happened. People would have been eating local produce and not thinking, or putting their clothes out on a rainy day, that kind of thing. So they were told lots of practical things to do to protect themselves and especially their children. So out of the CRERAD and various other organisations like ACRO, basically they were able to set up laboratories which were then able to very quickly check, and also get money together for testing equipment for nurseries. Now at all that time, CRERAD said nothing. And then exactly 1 year after, when they'd gone from, right, okay, we've done what we set out to do, which was to make these people radiologically aware. And there's lots of women that got involved in this. It was a great sort of, level playing field, for the people of Fukushima, because women have stepped forward and they're doing most of the testing. So you were having the point that every single kilogram of food that was brought into a nursery was being tested. With reasonably high quality equipment, that could say, oh, this has got more than a few becquerels in it, let's bin it, So, basically there was the under 1 becquerel campaign, which would have been cleaner than any food you could find in, sort of Europe or
probably the United States.
Exactly.
I mean, let's be clear, the United States is quite messy here. It's like, they tested us, they experimented on their people.
Yeah. And there was Japanese companies that very quickly, I think is it Clear Springs, I think they're called. I don't know what the Japanese name is, but they set up, and they were testing, they doing the same thing with all the food that they were selling. They would test it in the same vigorous way. And so they were, obviously trying to find places where the soils were clean and things. So they were actually able to set up. So all I'm saying is now CRERAD, if they wanted to do, after 1 year, CRERAD then put a video out, which was 3 months after the nuclear disaster, and it showed 6,000 hits per second. Right, and then when he put the he had his back to a window and he puts the Geiger counter in front of his chest, it dropped down to about 3,500 counts per second. This particular measuring device, and he was saying that that's 1,500 becquerels or 2,000 becquerels that my body is absorbing. Wow. And he was giving that as an example of how the damage is done.
It's so bizarre to think that this is part of the nuclear taboo, that we're just supposed to accept that this is just how the life is going to be now. We're going to have to accept that and the reality is we do have to accept it. We have had to have a come to Jesus moment on this one.
I don't think we have to accept it because for instance, for me, I mean, when there's a nuclear incident, there's quite a few people I can contact and say, hey, what's going on? And they may ask me, what's happening? and we'll share information.
Yes, I mean, I get it. We understand it, Shaun, but we're still affected.
Yeah, but the point is to fight against it, being a sort of constructive here, as opposed to, the sort of the downside. And I know the downside, believe me, but, and so do you,
I
many
think
others.
What we ought to do is push for solutions. Like all those pro-nukers, we need to convince them to start working on. And, they do know, like, about microbes. I mean, if, who was it? Chuck Hyman said everybody should just be pouring microbes on their grass. Just get microbes into the ground. Just pour microbes everywhere. Because that will help absorb it. You know what I mean? And maybe it's that simple. Maybe we could have these big industries where... But see, then you have to figure out, because if they're profit-driven, this is the problem with the capitalistic system. It's 100%.
Well,
you can't make a profit, they won't do it.
I think I say a lot of, not the worst, but say the intermediate, the sort of middle, the contaminated stuff, which is mostly cesium or strontium. In 600 years, that'll be completely gone, and it will have reduced to lead, and it would have been washed deep into the earth. And so, for most cases of contamination, in 600 years, a lot of the areas that are contaminated now will become kind of wildlife reserves, and as the 600 years, as they clean out, some of the areas like, for instance, Chernobyl itself, where the melted fuel is, that's not going to change anytime soon. And the risk for people around there won't change. But, when we're looking further afield, we're seeing people that are living in dodgy areas now, in 300, 400, 500 years, they'll be able to live there, and actually use the food they're making there, and eat the wild berries. But the wild berries.
Guy McPherson is?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we'll be here in 600 years. I mean,
well,
that's,
at the end of the day, I'm a little bit, I like what Guy does, and when we're looking at things like methane, and the scarier aspects of the climate change, the methane clatrate gun, they call it. But at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to sort of say how it's going to work out, because, this is an area where we haven't experienced it before. Things that the environment is chemically different to what human beings have ever experienced. So what the responses will be, and what the Earth's response will be to counter that, will it offer a quick response? In my case, I think we should just all be planting trees like anything, build up a rainforest.
Well, we should, because they're really knocking down the rainforest. I mean, this last year's been really hard. Those tribes have just been massacred in the last year in the rainforest. It's been very sad since there's been a lot of pullback. It's been very... I think this is why, I have learned that we actually, in order to change society, you only need 3.5% of the population. They've done study after study. That's really all you need, is to change how things go in the future. And if that's what we could do, imagine if we could just convert 3.5% of the nuclear scientists to say, we're going to make an effort to find a solution and stop this denial. And really, we know it harms people. That's another issue. We can leave that alone. But let's figure out a way to convert this, or figure out to help our environment cope with these radioactive nuclides, to neutralize them. I guarantee you within 5-10 years, boom, we could have a whole industry, and we could actually maybe fix it. And that's kind of my big dream, is that we could save humanity and our planet, and turn our planet back into something that our great-grandchildren will go, wow, man, we got just to the edge and they saved us, thank goodness.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've got a story here which I think is worth talking, and it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, okay.
Cool, well, that should do it. It's just to round off with this report from the UN. Now, there was the Universal Periodic Review of Japan occurred on, I think it was the 14th of November. It was live streamed, so you could hear, I think it was something up to I lost count. It was 138 people talking about what they're worried about. It was 108 speakers, I think I counted, so I don't think some did speak, but but there was 108 speakers. Japan did 2 segments. The Japanese government did 2 segments where they answered back the questions that people were asking about. And one was about halfway through, and the other one was right at the end. Just very quickly, it was quite amazing actually, because every year Japanese have managed to sort of divert the issue or whatever. Now there was five countries: Costa Rica, Germany, Austria, Mexico, and Portugal. And between them, they managed to ask some really good questions to do with Fukushima, and also to do with the Japanese secrets law, you know. Now, many other countries also talked about the Japanese secrets law and their concerns about it, all right, which is a very good thing. But this particular 5 countries discussed in one way or other the support that's needed for the victims of Fukushima. That was one big theme. There was also one of them was more specific on the proper health care and support for the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings. But the other 4 really talked about Fukushima, and the most outstanding one, who obviously knew a little bit about it, was Mr. Gunnar Schneider from Germany. And he said basically that he wants to call for a return to the safety limit of 1 millisievert per year, right, which is what we all live with. And he's saying they want to do that there. Now, bearing in mind it's 20 millisievert a year at the moment, all right? It's 5 millisievert a year in the worst parts of Chernobyl in Belarus and Ukraine, okay? But 1 millisievert a year, he's calling for that. And he's calling for fairness for the victims of the nuclear disaster, you know, who live in contaminated areas. And he's saying specifically he wants women, pregnant women and children to be more highly prioritised than has been before, you know, which is absolutely, completely true.
Yeah.
So I did a report on it, and I think it was 24 hours later I used to troll on Japan Today, I think I've told you. And they did an article which is very similar to mine, but it didn't add, you know, about the 1 millisievert bit, but it did mention about the pregnant women and children. It did report that, and it did also report on the basically the issue around the secrecy law. So it was quite good, and so people of Fukushima got a voice in this year's sessional of Universal Periodic Review, the 28th session. It was good news because it was the right to mention that, and it's been sourced through the UN. So,
I don't think people understand how suppressed they are.
No, absolutely. Well done to Portugal, because she was the first one to mention it on the out of the 108 speakers that I had to listen to. But there was other issues to do with Japan as well, comfort women and various other issues. But at least the people of Fukushima, the residents of Fukushima, have been given some validation as to concerns that they might have. And that's my final word.
I wish that they could just be evacuated. Anybody that wants to leave ought to be able to leave. This whole thing of pretending that it's not real, you know.
And giving them small amounts of compensation that don't make up for their loss. So it's terrible. And they're forcing people to go back to, they turn the tap off, you know, of compensation money to evacuees. So they're now having to be forced with the reality of, you know, high rents or go back to Fukushima, which is diabolical. They're just doing it for the 2020 Olympics. Disgusting.
Thanks, Shaun, for joining us.
No, my pleasure, Lonnie. You take care now. Very fond of you and many of the other sort of brave bloggers out there that are fighting against the tide. But, you know, as I said, I think we're winning.
Exactly. Put your courage feet on. We'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.